You ever roast marshmallows over a fire with your kids laughing beside you, thinking you're the luckiest man alive, only to find out your wife's been getting toasted with your friend's husband behind your back? Yeah, me neither. At least, not until that one summer trip to Deep Pines National Park. Let me tell you, Betrayal sure knows how to ruin a perfectly good campfire story. My name's Rick, 42 years old, proud owner of a pretty solid backhand in ping pong, a decent dad bod, and the kind of man who packs the car for a camping trip with militant precision. My wife, well, ex-wife now, was named Kara. She was the queen of Pinterest recipes and fake smiles. We had 2 kids, Dylan, 9, who could eat 12 hot dogs in one sitting and still complain he was hungry, and Bella, 7, who insisted every woodland creature she saw was a potential pet. The plan was simple: a week off the grid, for families, and lots of bug spray. Good, clean American fun. And like most disasters in life, it started out perfect. Kara and I had been rocky for a while. You know that weird feeling where someone still technically lives with you, but emotionally they're already renting space in someone else's heart or pants? Yeah, that. But we were making it work for the kids. Or so I thought. I even suggested the trip, hoping to reconnect. She smiled, kissed my cheek, and said, "That sounds like a great idea." I should have known right then. Anytime Kara agreed with me without suggesting some weird vegan twist, something was up. We drove 3 hours to Deep Pines, windows down, radio blaring, and the kids arguing over who got the last fruit snack. Standard family road trip chaos. We met up with the other families at campsite 17, including her best friend Mindy and Mindy's husband, Greg. Greg and I had been friends for years. He was the kind of guy who wore cargo shorts year-round and laughed way too hard at his own dad jokes. We all pitched tents together, shared chili, and cracked open beers while the kids ran around like caffeinated squirrels. The first 2 days were golden. Swimming in the lake, fishing with Dylan, and late-night ghost stories around the fire. Kara laughed more than she had in months, mostly at Greg's jokes. I figured she was just happy to be out of the house. I mean, what kind of monster suspect's cheating on a family camping trip? But now that I look back, the signs were there: too many walks with Greg to look for firewood, the way her eyes lingered just a little too long when he talked, and that laugh, oh that laugh she used to save for me. It was night 3 when it happened. Bella had just fallen asleep curled next to Kara, and Dylan was passed out with marshmallow goo in his hair. I was alone at the fire, tending to the embers, sipping warm beer from a solo cup. Greg and Kara had disappeared again, supposedly to help Mindy find her phone. Mindy, by the way, was already snoring in her hammock with one sock half off. I don't know what made me get up. Maybe instinct, or maybe the way betrayal stinks worse than burnt marshmallows. I walked toward the trailhead, quiet as I could, and there they were, just off the path near the edge of the woods. Not talking, not laughing, just close. Too close. I froze. My heart felt like it had fallen down a well. They didn't see me at first. I heard Kara whisper something, and then Greg touched her face. That's when I knew. This wasn't a one-time thing. This wasn't just a poor decision. This was betrayal, wrapped up in moonlight and selfishness. I stepped forward, and they both jumped like I was a bear crashing through the brush. Kara gasped. Greg actually said, "Rick, it's not what it looks like." Which is funny, because it looked exactly like caught cheating. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there and said, "Mindy's gonna love this story," and walked away. The rest of the night was a blur. I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Yeah, sure. But there was something else too, like being hit by a freight train while wearing a blindfold. Kara didn't follow me when I walked away. She didn't call out, didn't try to apologize or explain herself. Maybe she thought I was going to explode in some dramatic way, but I didn't. I just walked back to our tent, sat down, and stared at the small flicker of the campfire through the mesh walls. I could hear the crickets, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional drunken laugh from Greg and Mindy's tent. That's when the rage finally hit me, not in some outburst, but in a simmering, cold way. The betrayal had already sunk in. It was like someone had taken a sharp knife and twisted it slowly until it felt like my entire life had just been severed in two. Kara, my wife, had crossed the line. And so had Greg. The guy I trusted, the guy I laughed with, the guy who I thought was my friend. He'd been making moves on my wife for months, maybe even longer. I could picture it all, the secret glances, the flirtations, the hidden smiles. All the signs were there. I was just too blinded by normalcy to see it. The worst part? I had no idea how to confront them. I wasn't some tragic hero in a soap opera. I wasn't going to cry and beg for answers. I wasn't going to throw their faces in the dirt and demand they confess. No, I was going to do something much smarter, something they'd regret. They'd both have to face the consequences, but I wasn't going to be the one to get emotional. The next morning, I pretended everything was fine. Greg and Kara acted like nothing had happened, and the kids were oblivious as ever. I don't know how they did it, how they could both wear those fake smiles and keep up the charade, but they did. As if I hadn't caught them, as if everything was just a misunderstanding. Mindy was the only one who seemed off. She kept giving me these odd looks, probably trying to figure out why I was so quiet and distant. She asked me if I wanted to go fishing with Greg, but I politely declined. I had no interest in pretending to be buddies with the guy who'd been betraying me right under my nose. I didn't even want to look at him. I couldn't. And the worst part? I had to keep playing the part of the good husband, the good father, for the sake of the kids. I wasn't going to ruin the trip for them. Not yet. I'd wait. I'd bide my time. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned that deep purple, I had an idea. The fire crackled in front of me, and I just sat there, the embers dancing in my peripheral vision as my mind worked. I was done being the fool. The last thing I wanted to do was confront them right away. No, I needed to get them both alone, to see how far this had really gone. I needed proof that this wasn't just some one-off mistake on Kara's part. It was a calculated affair. That's when the plan started to take shape in my head. I wasn't going to scream or shout. I wasn't going to lose my temper or break things. No, I was going to get my revenge in a way that would make them both regret everything. I was going to make them feel the weight of their betrayal without even realizing it was coming. The next day, I played the good husband again. I acted normal. Kara asked me if I wanted to hike up to the viewpoint with her, but I declined. I wasn't going to let her off the hook that easily. I didn't know how long I could keep pretending, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized I had to be methodical. After all, this wasn't just about her. It was about Greg, too. They both needed to pay for what they'd done. So, I spent the next few hours while everyone else was out fishing or hiking, gathering evidence. I wasn't looking to humiliate them immediately. That would come later. I just needed to see the full extent of what I was dealing with. I found a few texts on Kara's phone when she'd left it on the picnic table to go to the bathroom. Nothing major at first, just some casual messages between her and Mindy. But then I saw a string of messages between her and Greg. They were flirtatious, sure, but they were also detailed, too detailed. "Can't wait to see you tonight," one read. Another said, "I'm so glad we're doing this. It feels right." There were messages about where they'd meet later that night. Kara had no idea I was looking, and I felt a sick sense of satisfaction knowing I had them both exactly where I needed them. The texts proved everything I needed to know. This wasn't just a slip-up. This was an affair, and I was going to use it to my advantage. I didn't confront Kara right then and there. I didn't storm over to Greg's tent and punch him in the face. No, I kept calm. I knew what I had to do. I kept the texts, and when they came back, all smiles and sunburns, I acted like everything was fine. I spent the evening hanging out with the kids, playing games, trying my best to look like the doting husband. But deep down, I was plotting. My mind was a chessboard, and every move I made was one step closer to taking down both of them. That night, after the kids went to bed and the adults sat around the fire, I waited for the right moment. Kara and Greg were sitting a little too close for comfort, exchanging looks when they thought no one was watching. I could feel my blood boiling, but I held it together. I didn't need to explode. No, this needed to be slow, methodical. I wasn't going to let them get away with this. When the fire burned down to embers, I stood up and said, "Hey, I'm going to take a walk, clear my head for a bit. You guys should get some rest." Kara asked if I was okay, but I just nodded and left. I needed the space. I needed to think. As I walked away from the campsite, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about standing up for myself, for my family. I wasn't going to let them get away with this betrayal. They'd pay, I promised myself, and they'd never see it coming. The days that followed were like walking on a tightrope. Every step I took, every word I said, felt calculated. There was a certain kind of chaos in keeping up the act, pretending like everything was normal when inside, my world had been shattered. But I wasn't about to let Kara, or Greg for that matter, think they could pull the wool over my eyes. No, I was playing the long game. I spent my days keeping my distance, watching from the sidelines as Kara and Greg continued their charade, laughing too hard at each other's jokes and making excuses for their constant disappearances. I'd always known their friendship had been close, but this was something else entirely. There were moments when Greg would give me that smile, the one he always had when we'd share a drink, but now it felt forced, like he was holding back something. Kara, on the other hand, seemed to be walking on eggshells around me. She'd make small talk, asking how I was doing, and I'd reply with a half-smile, pretending like I hadn't caught her with Greg in the woods. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had to maintain the facade if I was going to get the revenge I deserved. I couldn't afford to make a scene, not yet. The tension grew by the hour, like a drumbeat that kept pounding louder in my ears. It wasn't even subtle anymore, the way they'd glance at each other, the secret smiles they thought no one noticed. I wasn't stupid. I knew what was happening, and every time I caught them in those small moments, it only strengthened my resolve. But there was one thing I had to do before I could confront them. I needed to get everything in order. I needed to be prepared for the fallout, because I knew it was coming. I started making plans, gathering everything I'd need to turn this situation into something they couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about their betrayal anymore. It was about showing them that I wasn't the fool they thought I was. That night, I set my plan into motion. The campfire was still burning low when I slipped away from the group. Kara had gone to bed early, probably to meet up with Greg later. The kids were asleep in the tents, their peaceful faces in stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. I walked through the trees, my heart pounding, my mind racing. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, the kind you feel right before something big happens. I could hear the wind rustling through the leaves, and the sound of my own footsteps was the only thing that broke the silence. It felt like the calm before the storm. When I reached the spot where I had first caught Kara and Greg, I took a deep breath. This was it. I had everything in place, proof, a plan, and the confidence that I wasn't going to let them get away with it. I stood there for a moment, looking at the darkened trail ahead. I knew they were out there, somewhere, probably laughing at some stupid inside joke they shared, completely unaware that I was coming for them. They'd made their choice, and now it was my turn to make mine. I could feel my anger rise again, but this time, I didn't let it consume me. Instead, I let the coldness of the situation take over. I had to remain in control. I took my phone out of my pocket and sent a text to Greg. It was simple, but it would do the trick. Meet me at the clearing in 15 minutes. We need to talk. I knew it would get his attention. Greg wasn't an idiot. He probably figured out by now that I knew something was wrong, but now it was time for him to face the music. I didn't wait for a response. I just turned and walked back to camp, pretending like nothing had changed. When I returned, I found Kara sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. She looked up as I approached, and for a moment, our eyes locked. There was a brief flicker of guilt in her gaze, but she quickly masked it with a forced smile. "Hey," she said, "where have you been?" I shrugged. Just needed some air. It wasn't a lie. I did need air to think, air to calm down, air to prepare for what was coming next. She didn't press me further, which was just as well. She didn't need to know about the text I'd sent to Greg. She didn't need to know about my plan. As I sat down beside her, I could feel her watching me, waiting for some sign that I knew. But I didn't give her one. I simply stared at the fire, knowing that everything was about to come to a head. The minutes dragged on, and I could hear the distant sounds of laughter from Greg's direction. I didn't let it faze me. I was already 2 steps ahead. I waited until I saw Greg walking toward the clearing, his figure silhouetted by the dying light of the fire. His casual stroll gave him away. He thought he could show up and smooth talk his way through it. But this wasn't going to be like any other conversation we'd had. This was a confrontation, and I wasn't going to back down. I stood up and motioned for him to follow me. As we walked through the woods, the air between us grew thicker, more charged. I could feel his tension too, the way he kept glancing at me, trying to gauge whether I was going to explode or not. The clearing was just ahead, the moonlight casting an eerie glow on the ground. When we reached it, I turned to face him. "We need to talk," I said. Greg hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting between me and the shadows, but then he nodded, his confidence fading. "What about?" he asked, his voice sounding less sure now. "About you and Kara," I replied, keeping my tone calm, measured. I watched as the color drained from his face. He didn't say anything, just stood there, caught in the web of his lies. "You think I didn't notice?" I continued, my voice growing colder. "You think I didn't see how you two were sneaking around, laughing behind my back? You're both pathetic." Greg took a step back, but I wasn't done. "I know everything," I said, my voice low and menacing. "And it's time for you to pay for what you've done." The moment Greg's eyes widened, I knew I had him. He shifted nervously, and I could see the beads of sweat forming along his forehead. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For months, I had lived in the dark, oblivious to the treachery happening right under my nose. Now, in this quiet clearing beneath the indifferent stars, everything had come crashing down, and I was no longer the fool. He opened his mouth to say something, to offer some kind of excuse, but nothing came out. For a brief moment, I thought he might try to lie his way out of it, to deny it all and tell me it was just a misunderstanding. But I wasn't in the mood for his nonsense. "I'm not here for your excuses, Greg," I said, cutting him off. "I'm not here to listen to your pathetic justifications for betraying me and Kara. I've seen enough." He opened his mouth again, probably to say something about how it had been a mistake, or how it wasn't what I thought, but I didn't care. The truth was out now, and no amount of words would change that. For a moment, he just stood there, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. The confident, charming Greg I'd known for years was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he'd been caught in a web of his own making. I could see the wheels turning in his head, trying to figure out how to get out of this, how to salvage some piece of dignity. But there was no dignity left. Not after everything I had learned, not after the lies that had been woven between the three of us. I took a deep breath, the cool night air filling my lungs, and I leaned in closer, making sure my next words cut through the silence like a blade. "You both need to understand something," I said, my voice low but firm. "This isn't just about the two of you sneaking around. This is about trust, something that's been shattered beyond repair." He took a step back, his hands trembling slightly. The truth had done its work. There was no way out now. He had no escape, and neither did Kara. I wasn't sure what kind of reaction I was expecting from him. Anger? Guilt? Fear? What I got, though, was something entirely different. Greg's shoulders slumped, and he looked at the ground, defeated. "Rick," he started, but I wasn't about to let him get another word out. "Save it," I said, the words coming out with a quiet but undeniable venom. "I don't want to hear your apology. I don't care about your reasons. What I care about is what you've done, and how it's going to change everything." The thought of confronting Kara crossed my mind, but I knew that would be a conversation for later. Right now, it was just Greg and me, and the silence between us was suffocating. I could feel my pulse racing, but I wasn't about to give him the satisfaction of seeing my anger. No, I wasn't going to play into his hands. The power was mine now, and I was going to keep it. "You've got two choices, Greg," I continued, my voice still steady, almost too calm for the situation. "You can walk away and pretend like none of this happened, or you can face the consequences. But let me make something clear, you don't get to just waltz away from this, thinking you've pulled off some clever little secret. You're caught, and it's time for you to own up to it. Both of you." I let the words hang in the air, heavy and final. There was no going back now, not for any of us. Greg took another step back, his gaze flicking around the darkened woods as if he were looking for a way out. But there was none. He could run, but he couldn't hide from what had already been set in motion. "You think you're going to make us pay for this?" Greg asked, his voice shaky. I could see that old cocky bravado trying to resurface, but it was weak, nothing more than a desperate attempt to regain control. It was laughable. "No," I said, shaking my head slowly. "I'm not going to make you pay. I'm going to let life handle that. But you'll never forget this night. You'll never forget how easily everything you thought you could hide came crumbling down. And believe me, neither of you will ever see this coming." I paused, watching his reaction carefully, and then I gave him one last look. "Now go back to camp. And when you talk to Kara, make sure she knows the game's over. I won't be the one to expose you both. But don't think for a second that you're getting away with this." He didn't respond, just turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world had just been placed on them. I watched him disappear into the darkness before I turned and headed back to camp myself. As I walked back, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but I had started to take control. I wasn't going to be the victim in this story. No, I was going to be the one who wrote the ending. And that ending? It wasn't going to be pretty for Kara or Greg. When I reached the camp, I saw Kara sitting near the fire again, her eyes flicking up to meet mine. She looked at me with that same forced smile, the one that didn't quite reach her eyes. But I wasn't fooled. I knew exactly what she'd been up to, and I was done pretending I didn't. She stood up as I walked over, her movement slow, as if she were waiting for something, some sign from me. I didn't give her one. I just stood there for a moment, staring at her. "I know, Kara," I said quietly. Her eyes widened, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear flash across her face. But it was too late for her to backpedal. I know everything, I repeated. And I'm not going to pretend anymore. She opened her mouth to speak, but I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses. Not now. You've already done enough damage, Kara. You've betrayed me. You've betrayed this family. And you've betrayed yourself. There's nothing left to say. She took a step back, and for the briefest moment, I thought she might break down, but then she just nodded. I wasn't sure what came next. Maybe we'd talk. Maybe we wouldn't. But one thing was certain, the truth was out, and neither of us could go back to the way things were. Not after everything that had happened. The next morning was the worst kind of awkward. The air was thick with tension, and every word that passed between Kara, Greg, and me felt like it was wrapped in a layer of glass, just waiting to shatter. The kids, bless their oblivious hearts, ran around the campsite like everything was normal, laughing, playing, the usual chaotic joy of being a kid on a family trip. I watched them for a while, their innocent energy a cruel contrast to the storm brewing in the adults. I could hardly look at Kara. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd built a life with, had betrayed me in the most profound way possible. It wasn't just the affair, it was everything that led up to it, all the lies and the manipulation, the secret looks and the whispered conversations behind my back. But what hurt the most wasn't even the betrayal. It was the fact that she'd never thought I would find out. She'd been so sure she could keep this from me, so sure that I was either too naive or too distracted to notice what was going on right under my nose. And for a while, I was. But not anymore. Greg was no better. Watching him try to avoid my gaze, fidgeting like a kid caught stealing cookies, made me sick to my stomach. This wasn't the guy I had once called a friend. This was a man who'd used that friendship as a cover for his own selfish desires. A man who didn't have the guts to be honest about what he wanted. Instead, he hid behind his jokes and his charm, thinking he could slide by without anyone ever catching on. I had no sympathy left for him. If anything, I felt sorry for him. Because what was about to come next wasn't just going to be a slap on the wrist, it was going to be a wake-up call neither of them would forget. That morning, while everyone else was getting ready to pack up and head home, I made a phone call. I didn't care that it was early, or that I was being a little underhanded about it. This wasn't about playing fair anymore. This was about getting my revenge, and making sure that Kara and Greg understood the full weight of their betrayal. I called Mindy, Greg's wife, and told her everything. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't soften the blow. I told her about the late-night meetings, the secret messages, everything. I wasn't going to protect anyone anymore. If Kara and Greg thought they could get away with their lies, then it was time for Mindy to know the truth. The phone call was short, and Mindy's response was exactly what I expected, a stunned silence, followed by a wave of disbelief. I could practically hear the color drain from her face as I explained everything. She didn't say much, just that she would be right over. I didn't care what kind of scene she caused. I was done being the nice guy. Mindy showed up about an hour later, her face pale and tight with anger. I didn't even have to explain further. She knew exactly what had happened. When she saw Greg and Kara standing there, her expression turned from shock to fury in the blink of an eye. I didn't move. I didn't have to. I had done my part. Now it was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. Mindy stormed up to Greg first, her eyes blazing with hurt and rage. She didn't need words. Her glare said it all. "How long, Greg?" she demanded. "How long has this been going on?" Greg opened his mouth to speak, but Mindy wasn't having it. She shoved him back, her voice breaking as she yelled. "How could you do this to me? To us?" I just stood back and watched the spectacle unfold. Greg tried to explain himself, but no one was listening. His words fell flat against Mindy's tears, and for the first time, I saw him for what he really was, a coward. I wasn't sure if he felt guilty or if he was just trying to save his skin, but I didn't care anymore. He didn't deserve a shred of sympathy. Not after what he had done. Kara, on the other hand, just stood there, her face flushed with embarrassment. She didn't even try to defend herself. She couldn't. The truth was undeniable. Mindy turned on her next, her voice icy with disdain. "You're just as bad as he is," she spat. "I can't believe I ever called you my friend." And with that, Kara broke. She started crying, but there was no sympathy in my heart. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with it. I wanted to feel angry, to yell at her, but all I felt was a kind of cold detachment. It was over. She had already lost me. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but the apology didn't make it any better. It didn't change the fact that she'd chosen to betray me. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she added weakly, but I didn't want to hear it. There were no more excuses left. In the end, The confrontation was chaotic, messy, and gut-wrenching. But it was also the end of everything. Mindy left the campsite with Greg in tow, her silence louder than any words she could have said. Kara stayed behind for a while longer, but I could see the realization dawning on her that everything had changed. That the life we had built together, the marriage we had fought for, was now nothing more than a broken shell. There was no going back from this. I couldn't look at her the same way anymore. I couldn't look at Greg the same way. They had both betrayed me in ways that I couldn't forgive. That evening, as I sat by the fire alone, I realized something. Revenge wasn't about what I could do to them. It wasn't about getting back at them in some grand, dramatic way. It was about taking back my life. It was about reclaiming my peace and my dignity, and knowing that I didn't need either of them to feel whole. Life would go on. It would be hard, but it would go on. I would heal. The kids would heal. And Kara and Greg, they'd have to live with their choices. They'd have to live with the consequences of their betrayal. As the fire crackled and the night grew darker, I finally felt a sense of calm. The storm was over. The truth had been exposed, and everything was out in the open. There was no more pretending. And for the first time in a long time, I was free.